The chapel door creaked open on rusted hinges, and Preston Jameson froze at the sight of a woman kneeling before the simple wooden cross he'd carved 3 years ago, when grief had driven him to build this small sanctuary on the furthest corner of his ranch. Her dress was worn thin at the seams, the pale blue fabric faded from what must have once been a vibrant color, and her dark hair fell in a thick braid down her back. She didn't turn at the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. Her hands were clasped so tightly in prayer that her knuckles had gone white, and her lips moved in silent supplication. Preston cleared his throat. Still nothing. "Madam," his voice echoed in the small space, bouncing off the bare walls he'd constructed from pine logs. "This is private property." The woman's prayer ceased. Slowly, as if emerging from deep water, she turned her head. Her eyes were the color of honey in sunlight, and tears tracked down her dust-stained cheeks. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse as though she hadn't spoken in days. "I knew you would. I knew if I waited long enough, prayed hard enough, you'd finally come." Preston took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip. It was April of 1876, and the territory around Grass Valley, California, was still wild enough that a man learned to be cautious. "I don't know you, madam, and I don't know what you're talking about." She rose to her feet, swaying slightly, and he realized with a start how thin she was. Her dress hung loosely on her frame, and dark circles shadowed those honey-colored eyes. "My name is Wilhelmina Abbott. 3 years ago, a preacher came through the wagon train I was traveling with. He told me that God had shown him a vision, that I was meant to wait for a man with a kind heart and a chapel built from grief, who would find me when the time was right." "That's a nice story," Preston said, though his voice came out harder than he intended. "But I think you're confused, maybe got some sun sickness. When did you last eat?" Wilhelmina took a step toward him, and he saw the determination burning in her gaze despite her obvious weakness. "I ate yesterday. There's a stream not far from here where I've been catching fish. Wild onions grow nearby. I've survived, Mr. Jameson, because I had faith." The use of his name stopped him cold. "How do you know who I am?" I asked. "In town. 3 weeks ago, when I first arrived in Grass Valley." I described what I'd seen in my own visions, the dreams that came after the preacher spoke to me. A ranch at the base of the mountains, cattle grazing in green valleys, and a small chapel sitting alone on a hill. "They said it sounded like your land, so I came here. I've been waiting." Preston removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, which he knew was getting too long. He should have ridden into town for a trim weeks ago, but he'd been avoiding people. That was nothing new. Since Mary died bringing their stillborn son into the world 5 years ago, he'd avoided most human contact beyond what was necessary to run his ranch and conduct business. 3 weeks. He studied her more carefully, noting the weathered appearance of her dress, the worn soles of her boots. "You've been camping out here for 3 weeks, 3 years in a way," Wilhelmina said softly. "I've been waiting 3 years since the preacher's vision. 3 weeks since I found this place. Every day I come here and pray. I knew you'd enter eventually. This is your chapel after all." "It's not a real chapel," Preston said, his voice rough. "It's just a building. 4 walls and a roof. Somewhere I could come and talk to my wife without feeling like a fool for talking to a grave." Compassion flickered across Wilhelmina's face. "I'm sorry for your loss. I can feel the grief in this place. It's soaked into the wood, settled into the spaces between the boards. But there's something else here too. Hope. You built this from pain, but you built it nonetheless. That means some part of you still believes in something." Preston wanted to argue to tell her she was wrong, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "You need food, real food and water. Come back to the main house." "Are you going to send me away?" Wilhelmina asked, her voice trembling slightly. He should. Every practical bone in his body screamed that he should send this strange woman packing, give her some supplies and point her back toward town. But something in her eyes, something in the way she'd waited in his chapel with such patient faith, stopped him. "Let's get you fed first," he said finally. "Then we'll figure out what to do." The walk back to the ranch house took 15 minutes. Preston had built his chapel deliberately far from the main buildings, wanting solitude when he visited. Now he found himself acutely aware of the woman walking beside him, how she stumbled occasionally over roots and rocks, how she kept glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. His ranch house was simple but solid, built from good timber with a wide porch that faced west toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. He'd spent 5 years building this place up from nothing, nursing his grief through hard work and long days in the saddle. His herd had grown to nearly 300 head, and he'd hired 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn. "Wait here," he told Wilhelmina, gesturing to one of the chairs on the porch. "I'll bring out some food." Inside, he quickly assembled a plate of leftover biscuits, cold chicken from last night's dinner, and some cheese. He poured a glass of water from the pitcher and carried everything outside. Wilhelmina ate slowly, carefully, as though forcing herself not to devour everything at once. Preston sat in the other chair and watched the sun sink lower in the sky, painting the clouds orange and gold. "Tell me about the preacher," he said when she'd finished half the food. Wilhelmina set down the chicken leg she'd been working on and took a long drink of water. His name was Reverend Thomas Hartley. He was traveling west with our wagon train, heading to Sacramento to establish a church. One night, he sought me out specifically. Said he'd been praying for guidance about his own future when he received a vision about mine instead. "What exactly did he tell you?" "That I would find my home with a man who'd lost everything but hadn't lost himself. A rancher with land blessed by mountains and watered by clear streams. That this man had built a chapel from his grief, and when I found that chapel I should wait. Pray. Have faith. When the time was right, he would come to me." Preston shook his head. "Madam Wilhelmina, I don't know what this preacher thought he saw, but I'm not looking for a wife. I'm not looking for anything except peace and quiet to work my land." "I didn't come here expecting anything," Wilhelmina said, meeting his gaze directly. "I came because I had nowhere else to go, and the vision gave me something to believe in. My parents died of cholera on the trail. I had no other family, no money, no prospects. When we reached Sacramento, I worked whatever jobs I could find, saved every penny. But California is expensive, and opportunities for single women are limited unless you're willing to work in a saloon or worse." The bitterness in her voice spoke of hard experience, and Preston felt an unwelcome stirring of sympathy. "So you came looking for a fairy tale." "I came looking for hope," she corrected. "There's a difference. I'm not a foolish girl expecting some romantic fantasy. I'm a practical woman who has learned that sometimes faith is the only thing standing between you and complete despair. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But I'm asking you to let me stay a few days, rest, recover my strength. I'll work for my keep. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I don't expect charity." Preston studied her face, seeing the pride beneath the desperation, the strength beneath the exhaustion. Mary had been soft and gentle, raised in a comfortable home back in Ohio. This woman had been forged in harder circumstances, tempered by loss and survival. "You can stay in the spare room," he heard himself say. "Work in the house, help with the cooking and such. I'll pay you fair wages. But I need you to understand something, Wilhelmina. I'm not the man from your vision. I'm just a rancher trying to live a quiet life." I can offer you work and safety, but that's all." Relief flooded her features, making her look younger. He realized she was probably only in her early 20s, maybe 23 or 24. Young to have endured so much loss. "Thank you," she said softly. "You won't regret this." He already regretted it, but not for the reasons he'd expected. Something about this woman unsettled him, stirred feelings he'd thought died with Mary. That was dangerous. Feelings led to caring, caring led to loss, and he'd had enough loss to last a lifetime. The first few days passed in careful routine. Wilhelmina rose before dawn and had coffee ready when Preston came in from checking the cattle. She cooked meals that were simple but good, cleaned the house with quiet efficiency, and never pushed for conversation beyond what was necessary. His two ranch hands, Tom and Billy, were respectfully curious but kept their distance after Preston made it clear that Miss Abbott was an employee, nothing more. On the fourth day, Preston came in for lunch to find Wilhelmina standing at the kitchen window, tears streaming down her face. She quickly wiped them away when she heard his boots on the floor. "Sorry," she said, turning back to the stove where beans were bubbling, "just feeling foolish." "What's wrong?" The question surprised him. He'd meant to ignore whatever private grief she was experiencing, but the words came out anyway. "Today is my birthday. I'm 24. I was just thinking about my mother, wondering what she'd think of how I've ended up. Working as a housekeeper for a stranger, clinging to a vision that probably means nothing." Preston moved to the wash basin and cleaned his hands, buying time to think. "My wife used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go. Maybe visions are the same, hope looking for a place to land." Wilhelmina turned to look at him, surprise evident on her face. "That's a kind thought." Mary was full of kind thoughts, Preston said, then immediately regretted mentioning his wife's name. He never talked about Mary, had trained himself not to think about her during the day when there was work to distract him. "Tell me about her," Wilhelmina said softly. "Please. This house feels full of her memory, but I don't know anything real about her." He should refuse. Should keep that boundary firmly in place. But something about the date, about Wilhelmina's tears and her honesty, loosened his tongue. "She was small like you," he began, settling into a chair at the kitchen table, "but different in every other way. Gentle where you're strong. She loved flowers, used to spend hours planting the garden. Yellow roses were her favorite. She had a laugh that sounded like music." "How did you meet?" "Church social back in Ohio. I was working on her father's farm, saving money to head west. She brought me lemonade in the fields and we started talking. 6 months later, we were married. 2 years after that, we'd saved enough to buy this land and build our start. And then she died," Wilhelmina said gently. "Childbirth. The baby, our son, he was too early. Something went wrong. The doctor from town didn't get here in time. I held her while she bled, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing but watch her slip away." The memory still had the power to hollow him out, leave him feeling like a shell of a man. Preston stood abruptly, needing to move, to work, to do anything but sit with those feelings. "I'm sorry," Wilhelmina said. "I shouldn't have asked. It's your birthday," Preston said roughly. "Come on. There's something I want to show you." He led her outside and around to the side of the house where Mary's garden had once flourished. Now it was overgrown with weeds, the careful beds lost to neglect. But in one corner, a single yellow rosebush still bloomed, wild and untended but stubbornly alive. "She planted this the first spring we were here," Preston said. "It keeps coming back no matter how much I ignore it." Wilhelmina knelt beside the rosebush, carefully touching one of the blooms. "It's beautiful. Roses are survivors. People think they're delicate, but they're tough as nails when they need to be." Preston found his knife and cut 3 of the best blooms, handing them to Wilhelmina. "Happy birthday." She looked up at him, and something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, Preston lay in his bed and listened to the quiet sounds of someone else in his house. For 5 years, he'd lived alone except for the ranch hands who kept to the bunkhouse. Now there were soft footsteps in the hall, the creak of floorboards in the spare room, the small domestic noises of another person's presence. It should have bothered him. Instead, he found it oddly comforting. The weeks that followed developed their own rhythm. Wilhelmina proved to be an excellent cook, creative with the limited ingredients available. She started working on the garden, clearing weeds and preparing beds for planting. Preston found himself spending more time at the house than he had in years, often sitting on the porch in the evenings while Wilhelmina worked on mending clothes or shelling peas. They talked about small things at first: the weather, the cattle, plans for the ranch. Gradually, the conversations deepened. Wilhelmina told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her father's work as a blacksmith, her mother's skill with herbs and healing. She spoke about the wagon train journey west, the friends she'd made and lost, the harsh beauty of the territories they'd crossed. Preston found himself sharing stories about building the ranch, the challenges of those early years, even laughing as he recounted some of the mishaps and misadventures. It surprised him how easily the laughter came, how long it had been since he'd felt anything but the constant low-grade ache of loss. One evening in early May, about 6 weeks after Wilhelmina had arrived, Preston came back from moving cattle to find her sitting on the porch steps, her face troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling beside her. "I went into town today for supplies," she said. "Some of the women at the general store were talking. They seem to think that I'm here as more than a housekeeper." Preston felt heat rise in his face. "People talk. It doesn't mean anything. It means something to reputation. Yours and mine. I don't want to cause you trouble, Preston. Maybe I should look for work in town, find a room at the boarding house." The thought of her leaving hit him with unexpected force. "No," he said quickly, then moderated his tone. "I mean, you don't have to leave because of gossip. Your work here is valuable. I'd have to find someone else, and I don't want to do that." Wilhelmina turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes searching his face. "Is that the only reason you want me to stay?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Preston knew he should lie, should maintain the careful distance he'd tried to preserve. But sitting here in the fading light, watching the way the sunset caught in her dark hair, he found he couldn't. "No," he admitted quietly, "it's not the only reason." "Then what are we doing?" Wilhelmina asked softly. "What is this?" Preston stood and walked to the porch railing, gripping it tightly. "I don't know. I told myself I'd never care about anyone again. It's too much risk, too much potential for pain. But somehow you've gotten under my skin, Wilhelmina. I look forward to coming home now. I listen for your voice. When you smile, it feels like sun breaking through clouds." "I feel the same," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I know you didn't ask for this. I came here following a vision, expecting to find refuge. I didn't expect to find you, not really you, the man behind the grief, the one who brings me roses on my birthday and listens when I talk about my parents and laughs at my terrible jokes." "Your jokes are terrible," Preston agreed and felt his lips quirk into a smile. "See, you're smiling. You do that now. When I first arrived, I wasn't sure you remembered how." He turned to face her fully, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You did that. Somehow, you reminded me that being alive is different from just surviving." "Preston," Wilhelmina breathed, and he could see the hope and fear warring in her expression. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing someone again, scared of letting myself feel this much." but I'm more scared of letting you walk away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." "Then don't let me walk away," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "I've been waiting 3 years. I think I've been waiting for you specifically, even when I didn't know your name or your face. The vision brought me here, but what I feel for you has nothing to do with prophecy. It has to do with the man you are, the way you're patient with your horses, the way you built a chapel for your grief but still have room in your heart for hope, the way you look at me like I matter." "You do matter," Preston said, and then he was kissing her, pulling her close, finally giving in to the feelings he'd been fighting for weeks. Wilhelmina melted against him, her arms coming up around his neck. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, then deepening as weeks of suppressed longing broke free. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it's fast. I know people will talk even more than they already are, but I don't want to wait, don't want to waste any more time. Life's too short and too uncertain. Marry me, Wilhelmina." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." They married 3 weeks later in Preston's chapel, with Tom and Billy serving as witnesses and the circuit preacher performing the ceremony. Wilhelmina wore a new dress she'd made herself from fabric Preston insisted on buying, a soft cream color with blue trim that matched her eyes. Preston wore his best suit, the one he'd packed away after Mary's funeral and never expected to wear again. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. When Preston slipped a gold ring onto Wilhelmina's finger, he felt something shift in his chest, like a door that had been locked for years finally swinging open. "I love you," he whispered as they stood together in the chapel where she'd waited for him. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words again, but I love you." "I love you too," Wilhelmina replied, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for giving my faith somewhere to land." The ranch hands had prepared a celebration back at the house, with food and even a fiddle player from town. Preston danced with his new wife under the stars, feeling lighter than he had in years. Wilhelmina's laugh rang out across the ranch yard, and he realized he'd been wrong before. Mary's laugh had sounded like music. Wilhelmina's laugh sounded like home. That night, they came together in Preston's room, which was now their room, with tenderness and passion. Wilhelmina was nervous, admitting it was her first time, and Preston was gentle, patient, showing her with his hands and body how much she meant to him. Afterwards, they lay tangled together and Preston traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "Tell me something," he said into the darkness. "Do you really believe it was a vision? That some preacher saw the future and sent you here to me?" Wilhelmina was quiet for a long moment. "I believe that sometimes we need a reason to hold on," she said finally. "Whether that reason comes from God or our own desperate hope doesn't matter as much as the fact that it keeps us going. The preacher gave me a reason to survive. You gave me a reason to live. That's miracle enough for me." Preston kissed her temple. "Miracle enough for me too." The months that followed were among the happiest of Preston's life. Wilhelmina transformed the house into a real home, with curtains in the windows and meals served at regular times, and laughter echoing off the walls. She restored Mary's garden, planting vegetables alongside the roses, and Preston found he could look at the yellow blooms without feeling the old stabbing grief. The sadness was still there, always would be, but it had gentled into something bearable, a scar instead of an open wound. In September, Wilhelmina told him she was pregnant. Preston felt fear lance through him at the news, memories of Mary's death rising up to choke him. Wilhelmina saw it in his face immediately. "I know you're scared," she said, taking his hands in hers. "I'm scared too." But Preston, we can't live our lives afraid of what might happen. We have to trust that this time will be different. I can't lose you, he said roughly. I won't survive it again. You won't lose me, she promised. I'm strong. The journey west, the years of surviving on my own, they made me strong. And I'll have the best doctor money can buy and you beside me, and faith that everything will be all right. Preston hired a woman from town, Mrs. Henderson, who had experience with childbirth. He made sure Wilhelmina rested, didn't let her do heavy work, and worried constantly despite her assurances that she felt fine. Tom and Billy handled more of the ranch work, giving Preston time to hover anxiously over his wife. "You're going to drive yourself mad," Wilhelmina told him one evening in late March when she was heavy with child and the birth was expected any day. "And you're going to drive me mad along with you. I'm fine. The baby is fine. Stop looking at me like I'm made of glass." "I can't help it," Preston admitted. "Every time I look at you, I remember I'm not Mary," Wilhelmina said gently but firmly. "I'm sorry that she died. I'm sorry you went through that horror. But I'm a different woman with a different body, and you have to believe that this story will have a different ending." 2 days later, Wilhelmina's labor began. Preston sent Billy racing to town for the doctor while Mrs. Henderson took charge. The hours that followed were the longest of Preston's life. He paced the porch, prayed in his chapel, and tried not to let his fear consume him. When Mrs. Henderson finally called him inside, he burst through the door expecting the worst. Instead, he found Wilhelmina propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted but smiling, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Preston approached slowly, hardly daring to believe it. The baby was tiny, red-faced and squalling with a shock of dark hair. Wilhelmina placed him carefully in Preston's arms and he stared down at this new life, this miracle he'd never expected to have. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, tears running freely down his face. "You're perfect. God, Wilhelmina, I was so scared." "I know," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "But we're okay. We're all okay." They named the boy Peter after Preston's father. Peter James Jameson proved to be a healthy, happy baby with strong lungs and an appetite to match. Preston discovered that fatherhood at 33 was different from how he'd imagined it would be at 28. He was older, more patient, more grateful for every moment. Wilhelmina recovered quickly from the birth, and within weeks was back to her usual routines, though Preston and Mrs. Henderson both insisted she take things slowly. The ranch thrived that year. Preston's herd grew, and he was able to hire 2 more hands to help with the work. On a warm evening in June, when Peter was 3 months old, Preston and Wilhelmina sat on the porch watching the sunset. The baby dozed in Wilhelmina's arms and Preston had his arm around his wife's shoulders. "You ever think about that preacher?" Preston asked. "Wonder if he knew how it would all turn out?" "Sometimes," Wilhelmina admitted. "I wish I could thank him. Not for the vision, necessarily, but for giving me hope when I had nothing else. That hope led me here to you, to this life." Whatever his motives were, whether it was divine inspiration or just kind manipulation, the result is that I found my home. "Our home," Preston corrected, pulling her closer. "I was just existing before you came along, surviving, like you said. You taught me how to live again." "We taught each other," Wilhelmina said. "You gave me safety and love. I gave you a reason to open your heart again. We're a good team." "The best team," Preston agreed. Little Peter stirred and made a small sound. Wilhelmina adjusted him gently, and Preston marveled at how natural she was at motherhood, how she'd taken to it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. "I want more," Wilhelmina said suddenly. "More children, I mean, if that's all right with you. I know you were terrified during Peter's birth, but I want him to have siblings. I want a house full of life and noise and love." Preston was quiet for a moment, examining his feelings. The fear was still there, probably always would be. But it was overridden by something stronger: trust. Trust in Wilhelmina's strength, trust in their love, trust that they could face whatever came together. "I want that too," he said finally. "A house full of life sounds perfect." Over the next 5 years, their family grew. A daughter named Wendy arrived 2 years after Peter, followed by twin boys, Thomas and Robert, 2 years after that. The ranch house expanded with additions to accommodate the growing family, and the sound of children's laughter became a constant backdrop to daily life. Wilhelmina proved to be an exceptional mother, patient and loving but firm when needed. She taught the children to read using the Bible and the few other books they owned. And in the evenings, she would tell them stories about the wagon train journey west, about courage and faith and the importance of hope. Preston threw himself into fatherhood with a devotion that sometimes surprised him. He taught Peter to ride when the boy was only 5, patiently leading the small horse around the corral while his son whooped with joy. He helped Wendy plant her own section of garden, just as he had with her mother. And when the twins arrived, loud and demanding and utterly exhausting, he walked the floors with them at night, singing the same lullabies his own mother had sung to him decades ago. The ranch prospered. Preston's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread, and he was able to buy adjacent land, expanding his holdings significantly. He hired a foreman to help manage the growing operation, which freed him to spend more time with his family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Preston took Wilhelmina back to the chapel where she'd waited for him, where they'd been married. It was evening, and golden light slanted through the single window he'd installed. "You remember the first time I saw you here?" Preston asked, sitting beside her on the simple wooden bench. "You were praying, and you looked so certain, so full of faith." "I was terrified," Wilhelmina admitted with a laugh. "I'd been waiting for 3 weeks, running out of supplies, starting to think I'd made a terrible mistake. But I couldn't give up. I'd already invested 3 years in believing. 3 more weeks didn't seem like much in comparison. What would you have done if I'd never come? If I'd decided to stop visiting the chapel?" "I don't know," Wilhelmina said honestly. "I suppose I would have gone into town eventually, found work, tried to build some kind of life. But I believe you would have come eventually. Something would have drawn you here." "Fate?" Preston asked, a hint of teasing in his voice. "Love," Wilhelmina corrected. "I think our souls recognized each other, even before we met. Your grief built this chapel, and my hope led me to it. We were always going to find each other. It was just a matter of when." Preston took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band she wore. "I'm glad it was when it was. I needed those 5 years of grieving. I needed to work through the worst of the pain before I could be ready for you. If you'd come earlier, I don't think I could have let you in. And I needed those 3 years of hoping," Wilhelmina said. "They taught me patience and faith. They prepared me to appreciate what I have now. Our timing was perfect, even though it didn't feel that way while I was waiting." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching dust motes dance in the evening light. Preston thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, hollow and hurting, convinced that his capacity for joy had died with Mary. He'd been wrong. The heart was more resilient than he'd known, capable of healing and loving again without diminishing what had come before. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For waiting. For believing. For teaching me that it's possible to build something new from grief without betraying the past. Mary will always be part of my story, but you, Wilhelmina, you're my present and my future. You and our children." Wilhelmina leaned her head on his shoulder. And thank you for being the man I waited for. Not the vision, not the dream, but the real flesh and blood man who cuts roses on birthdays and worries too much during pregnancies and makes our children laugh with his terrible horse impressions." Preston chuckled. "They're not terrible. The children love them. The children are kind. The impressions are terrible." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Preston marveled at how full his life had become. The ranch that had once been a lonely outpost was now a thriving home. The chapel built from grief had become a place of joy, where he and Wilhelmina sometimes brought the children to teach them about faith and resilience. As the years continued to pass, Preston watched his children grow. Peter became a serious boy, interested in the ranch operations and always wanting to help with the cattle. Wendy inherited her mother's gift for growing things, spending hours in the garden and bringing in baskets of vegetables. The twins were wild and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief but impossible not to love. When Peter turned 12, Preston decided it was time to teach him the full story of how his parents had met. They rode out to the chapel together one Sunday afternoon, just the two of them. "I want to tell you something," Preston said as they dismounted, "about your mother and about this place." They sat on the chapel steps, and Preston recounted the whole story. Wilhelmina's journey west, the preacher's vision, the 3 years of waiting and hoping, the 3 weeks she spent camping near the chapel before Preston finally arrived. Peter listened with wide eyes, occasionally asking questions. When Preston finished, the boy was quiet for a long moment. "So Ma was here praying before she even knew you," Peter said finally. "That's right. She had faith that she'd find what she was looking for even when it seemed impossible." "That's brave," Peter said, "to believe in something you can't see." "It is," Preston agreed. "But that's what faith is, son, believing in possibilities. Your mother taught me that. I'd stopped believing in much of anything before she came along." "Do you think it was real?" Peter asked. The vision the preacher had. Preston considered the question carefully. "I think it doesn't matter whether it was a real vision or just a kind man giving a desperate girl something to hold on to. What matters is that it brought your mother to me, and that brought all of you into the world. Whether it was God or chance or just remarkable coincidence, I'm grateful for it." Peter nodded slowly, processing this. "I'm glad Ma didn't give up. I'm glad she waited for you. Me too, son, me too." That evening at dinner, with all 4 children gathered around the table and Wilhelmina serving one of her excellent stews, Preston felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost overwhelmed him. This was his life now. Not the lonely existence he'd resigned himself to, not the desperate grief that had consumed him for years, but this: noise and laughter and love and the ordinary chaos of a large family. After the children were in bed, Preston and Wilhelmina stood on the porch as they did most nights, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Peter told me you explained how we met," Wilhelmina said. "He had a lot of questions at dinner. I hope that's all right." "I thought he was old enough to understand. It's more than all right. I want our children to know our story. I want them to understand that sometimes the most important things in life require patience and faith, and the courage to keep hoping even when circumstances are difficult." Preston pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "You know what amazes me most? How normal this all feels now. 5 years ago, the idea of being this happy seemed impossible. Now I can't imagine any other life." "That's healing," Wilhelmina said softly. "That's what it looks like when you let yourself love again. The past doesn't disappear, but it stops defining everything. You can honor what was while still embracing what is." "When did you get so wise?" Preston asked, a smile in his voice. "I've always been this wise." "You just weren't paying attention." Preston laughed, the sound rich and full in the night air. "I'm paying attention now." They stood together in comfortable silence, and Preston thought about that day 6 years ago when he'd walked into his chapel and found a strange woman praying. How skeptical he'd been, how resistant to the possibility of connection. If someone had told him then that this woman would become his wife, the mother of his children, the center of his world, he would have thought them mad. But life, he'd learned, had a way of surprising you, of taking grief and transforming it into hope, of leading lost souls to exactly where they needed to be, even when they didn't know they were searching. Another 5 years passed in the rhythms of ranch life and family routines. Peter grew into a responsible young man, taking on more ranch duties and showing real skill with the cattle. Wendy became interested in herbs and healing, spending time with Mrs. Henderson learning about home remedies and midwifery. The twins, now 10, were still a handful but had channeled some of their wild energy into helping with the horses. Preston was 43 now, with silver threading through his dark hair. Wilhelmina was 34, as beautiful as ever, though laugh lines had formed around her eyes and mouth. They'd added another child to their family, a girl named Margaret who was now 5 years old and utterly adored by her older siblings. The ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres, with a herd of 500 cattle and a dozen horses. Preston had built a new barn and expanded the bunkhouse to accommodate the 8 men now working for him. The operation ran smoothly under the foreman's management, allowing Preston to focus on the bigger picture and spend time with his family. One autumn evening, Preston and Wilhelmina were going through the ranch accounts in Preston's office when a knock came at the door. Billy, one of the original ranch hands who was now the head wrangler, stood on the porch looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to disturb you, boss, but there's a man here asking for Wilhelmina. Says his name is Reverend Hartley." Wilhelmina's head snapped up, shock written across her face. "Thomas Hartley, here. Says he's passing through Grass Valley and heard mention of a Mrs. Jameson who'd come from a wagon train years back. Wondered if it might be you." Preston and Wilhelmina exchanged glances. After a moment, Wilhelmina nodded. "Send him in, Billy. Thank you." The man who entered was elderly now, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a gentle, weathered face. But his eyes were sharp and kind, and Wilhelmina recognized him immediately despite the years. "Reverend Hartley," she breathed, standing. "I can't believe it's you." "Miss Abbott," the Reverend said, then corrected himself with a smile. "Mrs. Jameson, I should say. I'm so pleased to find you well." "Please, sit down," Preston said, gesturing to a chair. "Can we offer you something to eat, something to drink? Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Wilhelmina hurried to the kitchen and returned with coffee and some cake. As the Reverend settled with his refreshments, Preston studied him carefully. This was the man whose words had sent Wilhelmina on her journey, who had given her the vision that had brought her here. "I've wondered about you over the years," the Reverend said, looking at Wilhelmina. "After we parted ways in Sacramento, I often thought about that conversation we had. I hoped my words brought you some measure of comfort during difficult times." "They brought me more than comfort," Wilhelmina said. "They brought me here, to Preston, to this ranch, to the life I have now." She gestured around the comfortable room, and Preston could hear the sounds of children playing upstairs, Margaret's high laugh mingling with the twins' deeper voices. "I'm glad," Reverend Hartley said simply. "That was my hope, that you would find peace and purpose." "Reverend," Preston said carefully, "I need to ask you something. The vision you had, the one you shared with my wife, was it real? Did you truly see something, or were you trying to give a desperate girl something to believe in?" Reverend Hartley set down his coffee cup and looked at Preston with those sharp, kind eyes. "Does it matter?" "I don't know," Preston admitted. Maybe not, but I'm curious. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, I've been a preacher for 50 years. In that time, I've learned that faith and compassion are often indistinguishable. Did I have a vision sent by God? I believed I did. I was praying for guidance, and an image came to me so clearly that I felt compelled to share it with Miss Abbott. But was it divine inspiration or my own mind creating a story to help a young woman I could see was drowning in despair? I honestly don't know. And it doesn't matter, Wilhelmina said softly. What matters is that I believed. That belief kept me alive and led me here. Whether the vision came from God or from the kindness of a good man's heart, the result is the same. Precisely, Reverend Hartley said. I've learned that God works through many channels, sometimes through miraculous visions, sometimes through the simple human impulse to ease another's suffering. The line between the two is thinner than we might think. Preston felt something settle in his chest, a question he hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally answered. Thank you for giving her hope, he said, for sending her on the path that led here. I was lost when she found me, and I didn't even know it. We're all lost until we're found, the Reverend said with a smile. That's the human condition. You're blessed to have found each other. They invited Reverend Hartley to stay the night, and at dinner, he charmed all the children with stories of his travels and gentle wisdom. Margaret sat on his lap for most of the meal, fascinated by his white beard, and even serious Peter laughed at the Reverend's tales. The next morning, as Reverend Hartley prepared to continue his journey, he blessed the family on the front porch. He placed a hand on each child's head, murmuring prayers, and when he came to Preston and Wilhelmina, he said, "You've built something beautiful here. Not just a ranch or a family, but a testament to the power of hope and love. Hold tight to that. Teach your children to do the same." "We will," Wilhelmina promised, tears in her eyes. They watched the old man ride away, and Preston put his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Do you feel like something's complete now?" he asked. "Like a circle has been closed?" "Yes," Wilhelmina said. "I think I needed to see him again to thank him, even if I couldn't get the definitive answer about the vision. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is this." She gestured to their house, their children, their life. "Everything I hoped for and more than I could have imagined." The years continued their steady march. Peter, at 21, married a girl from town, a smart young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property, and Peter took over more of the daily ranch operations, showing a natural talent for management. Wendy, at 19, had decided to study nursing and was working with the doctor in Grass Valley, learning all she could about medicine and healing. She had no shortage of suitors, but she was in no hurry to marry, wanting to establish herself in her chosen profession first. Preston admired her determination, even as he worried about her future. The twins had grown into strong young men of 17, still mischievous but hardworking. Thomas wanted to start a horse breeding operation, while Robert was interested in expanding into sheep ranching. Preston listened to their ideas and encouraged them to pursue their dreams while learning the fundamentals of ranching. Margaret, now 12, was showing signs of inheriting her mother's practical competence and her father's head for business. She kept detailed records of the garden production and had started selling surplus vegetables in town, saving every penny with plans to one day open her own store. And then there was young Daniel, born when Wilhelmina was 38 and Preston was 47. They'd thought their family was complete, but Daniel's arrival had been a joyful surprise. Now 7 years old, he was a bright, curious boy who followed his father everywhere and asked endless questions about how things worked. Preston was 54 now, his hair more silver than dark, his body showing the effects of decades of hard work. But he was happy, truly happy, in a way he'd once thought impossible. The grief for Mary had softened into gentle remembrance. He could think of her now with fondness and sadness, but without the crushing weight of loss. One evening, as spring was turning into summer, Preston and Wilhelmina took a rare moment alone, walking out to the chapel as they sometimes did when they needed to talk or simply be together in the place where their story had begun. The chapel had weathered well over the years. Preston maintained it carefully, and it had become a special place for the whole family. Sometimes they held informal services there, and the children often came to think or pray when they needed solitude. 17 years, Wilhelmina said, settling on the bench inside. Can you believe it's been 17 years since you found me here? Sometimes it feels like yesterday, Preston said, sitting beside her. Other times it feels like you've been part of my life forever, like I can barely remember what it was like before you. That's how it should be, Wilhelmina said, taking his hand. The past doesn't disappear, but it integrates, becomes part of the foundation instead of the whole structure. Preston looked around the small chapel, remembering the grief that had driven him to build it, the rage and sorrow that had needed somewhere to go. I built this as a monument to loss, he said, but it became a place of finding. That seems appropriate somehow. Life is like that, Wilhelmina said. We build walls around our pain, and somehow those walls become bridges. We try to contain our grief, and it transforms into something else, something better. You sound like Reverend Hartley, Preston said with a smile. He was a wise man. I'm glad we got to see him again before he died. They'd received word 2 years ago that Reverend Hartley had passed peacefully in his sleep in Sacramento. Preston and Wilhelmina had attended the memorial service, wanting to pay their respects to the man who had, in his own way, brought them together. You think Peter and Sarah will have children soon? Wilhelmina asked, changing the subject to lighter matters. Sarah's hinted that they're hoping. Peter's worried about being a good father. He'll be wonderful. He learned from the best. Preston squeezed her hand. I learned from you. Before you, I didn't know how to be open, how to be vulnerable. You taught me that strength includes softness, that being a good father means being present and patient and willing to admit when you're wrong. And you taught me that it's possible to trust again, Wilhelmina said. After my parents died, after years of struggling alone, I'd built walls around my heart. You showed me it was safe to lower them. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Preston thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the twists and turns, the losses and discoveries. If someone had told his younger self that his greatest love story would begin with finding a strange woman praying in his chapel, he would have laughed at the impossibility. But life, he'd learned, specialized in the impossible. We should head back, Wilhelmina said eventually. Daniel will want his bedtime story, and I promised Margaret I'd help her with her dress for the social next week. Preston stood and helped his wife to her feet. They'd both aged, their bodies showing the wear of years and work, but he still found her beautiful. More than that, he found her essential, as necessary as breath. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and Preston felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. This life, this family, this love, it had all seemed impossible once. But Wilhelmina had waited 3 years, had kept faith when everything seemed hopeless, and that faith had been rewarded. I love you, he said as they reached the porch. I know I tell you that every day, but I don't know if you understand how much. You saved me, Wilhelmina. You brought me back to life. We saved each other, she corrected, reaching up to touch his weathered face. That's what love does. It rescues us from our loneliness and fear. It gives us a reason to hope, to try to believe in tomorrow. Inside the house, Daniel came running, launching himself at Preston with the absolute trust of a beloved child. Preston caught him and swung him up, listening to the boy's excited chatter about something he'd discovered in the barn. Margaret was setting the table for tomorrow's breakfast, efficient and careful. From upstairs came the sound of the twins arguing good-naturedly about something. This was his life. Loud and messy and full of constant demands. And it was perfect. That night, after all the children were finally settled and the house was quiet, Preston lay in bed with Wilhelmina in his arms. She was reading by lamplight, a habit she'd never outgrown, while he simply held her and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. "Preston," she said softly, setting aside her book. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come to the chapel that day? If you decided to skip your visit or if I'd given up and left?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't think that was possible. I think we were always going to find each other. One way or another our paths would have crossed." "You believe in fate now?" Wilhelmina asked, a teasing note in her voice. "I believe in you," Preston said simply. "I believe in the kind of love that waits 3 years. I believe that some people are meant to find each other, and that the universe, or God, or whatever you want to call it, conspires to make it happen." Wilhelmina turned in his arms to face him. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me." "Then I've been doing something wrong for 17 years. She laughed and kissed him, and Preston marveled again at how lucky he was. To have loved once and lost, then found the courage to love again. To have built a family and a life from the ashes of grief. To wake up every morning next to this woman who had waited for him before she even knew his name. Time marched forward as it always did. Peter and Sarah welcomed their first child, a boy they named after Preston. Wendy eventually fell in love with a doctor from San Francisco who'd come to Grass Valley to open a practice, and their wedding was a joyous celebration attended by half the town. The twins both married within a year of each other, Thomas to a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, and Robert to a girl he'd known since childhood. They built houses on the ranch and started families of their own, keeping the land in the Jameson name and growing the operation. Margaret did indeed open her store in town when she turned 21, a general goods shop that quickly became popular for its fair prices and quality merchandise. She married at 25 to a banker who appreciated her sharp mind and business sense. Daniel, the baby of the family, grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man with a gift for working with horses. He stayed on the main ranch with Preston and Wilhelmina, gradually taking over more responsibilities as Preston aged. Preston turned 65 in the spring of 1889, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. The ranch had grown to encompass over 2,000 acres, and the Jameson name was well respected throughout Nevada County. He'd built something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. On a warm June evening, Preston and Wilhelmina, now 56, took their familiar walk to the chapel. It was something they did less frequently now, their bodies not as strong as they once were, but they still made the journey when they needed to reconnect with their roots. 24 years, Preston said, settling carefully onto the bench. His joints ached more these days, and he moved more slowly, but his mind was still sharp, and his love for Wilhelmina undiminished. 24 years of marriage, Wilhelmina agreed. 27 years since I first came to this chapel and waited. It seems like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago, a different life entirely. Wilhelmina leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence. Preston thought about all the moments that had brought them here, all the choices and chances and small miracles that had woven their lives together. "I'm tired," Wilhelmina said softly. More tired than I used to be. Does that frighten you? Preston's heart clenched. They didn't often speak about aging, about the inevitable end that approached for all people. But they were both getting older, both slowing down. It terrifies me, he admitted. The thought of losing you is the only thing that can still bring me to my knees. But I'm also grateful. Grateful for every day we've had, every moment we've shared. When you go, whenever that day comes, I'll grieve, but I won't regret, not a single second. Me neither, Wilhelmina said. I was supposed to wait 3 years for you, but I would have waited 30 if necessary. You were worth every moment of uncertainty, every doubt, every difficult day. Promise me something, Preston said. Anything. Promise me you'll fight. That when your time comes, you won't go easy. I know that sounds selfish, but I need you to stay with me as long as possible. Wilhelmina turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes still as bright as they'd been when she was 24. I promise to fight for every day. But Preston, when my time does come, you have to promise me you'll keep living, not just surviving like you did before I arrived, really living, for our children and grandchildren, for yourself. I don't know if I can, Preston said honestly. You can. You've learned how, and you won't be alone. You'll have Daniel here and Peter nearby and all our other children visiting. You'll have the ranch and the chapel and all the memories we've built. You'll have purpose and love and reasons to get up each morning. Preston pulled her close, holding tight. I'll try. That's the best I can promise. They sat together as the light faded, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love that had sustained them through decades. The chapel around them held all their history, all their prayers and hopes and fears. It was sacred space, not because of any formal blessing, but because of what had happened here. A lonely man had found a hopeful woman, and together they had created a life worth living. The years continued, bringing more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch remained prosperous under the combined management of Daniel and Peter. Preston officially retired at 70, handing over the reins but still offering advice when asked. Wilhelmina's health began to decline when she was 62. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a steady loss of energy. Preston watched helplessly as the vibrant woman he'd loved for 3 decades became frailer, more tired, more often confined to the house. Wendy, now a skilled nurse, came to help. She examined her mother thoroughly and spoke quietly with Preston in his office afterwards. Her heart is wearing out, Wendy said gently. It's not something that can be fixed. All we can do is keep her comfortable and make sure she's not in pain. Preston had known this day would come, had been preparing for it for years, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. How long? He asked, his voice rough. Months. Maybe a year if we're lucky. I'm sorry, Papa, I know this isn't what you want to hear. Preston pulled his daughter into a hug, holding tight. Thank you for being honest, and thank you for being here. The family rallied around Wilhelmina. The children visited frequently, bringing the grandchildren to brighten her days. Preston rarely left her side, sleeping in a chair in their bedroom so he could wake if she needed anything. On a cool October evening, Wilhelmina asked Preston to take her to the chapel one last time. He wanted to refuse, worried the journey would be too taxing, but something in her eyes stopped him. With Daniel's help, they made the trip slowly in a small wagon, Wilhelmina wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. Inside the chapel, Preston helped her sit on the bench, settling beside her with his arm around her shoulders. She leaned heavily against him, her breathing labored but her mind clear. This is where it all began, she said softly. I remember kneeling right there, praying, wondering if I was a fool for believing. Then you walked in, looking so stern and suspicious, and I thought my heart might burst from hope and fear combined. You looked half-starved and completely certain, Preston said. I didn't know what to make of you. I didn't know what to make of myself, Wilhelmina admitted. I was running on faith and desperation. If you'd sent me away, I don't know what I would have done. I could never have sent you away, Preston said. I knew it even then, though I tried to deny it. Something in your eyes, in your voice, it called to something in me. Like recognizing a piece of myself I didn't know was missing. Wilhelmina took his weathered hand in her smaller one, tracing the lines and calluses with gentle fingers. We've had a good life, Preston. Better than I ever dreamed possible. 6 children, 15 grandchildren so far, and more on the way. A ranch that will continue for generations. A love story that began with faith and grew into something real and lasting. It's not over, Preston said fiercely. You're still here. We still have time. Not much time, Wilhelmina said gently. We both know that. But whatever time we have, it's enough. It has to be. We've been so blessed, Preston. Let's not waste our last days together mourning the inevitable. Let's celebrate what we've had. Preston felt tears running down his face, hot against his cool skin. I don't know how to let you go. You don't have to let me go. I'll always be with you, in this chapel, in our home, in the faces of our children and grandchildren. Love doesn't end just because life does. They sat together until the sun set and the chapel filled with shadows. Daniel came to fetch them, helping his mother back to the wagon with infinite gentleness. Preston watched his youngest son with Wilhelmina and saw the love there, the fear of losing her that mirrored his own. Back at the house, Preston helped Wilhelmina to bed. She was exhausted from the outing but seemed at peace, more settled than she'd been in weeks. Thank you, she whispered as he pulled the blankets up around her. Thank you for taking me there one last time. I needed to say goodbye to that place, to close that circle. Sleep now, Preston said, kissing her forehead. I'll be right here. Wilhelmina died 3 weeks later on a quiet November morning with Preston holding her hand and all 6 children gathered around the bed. Her passing was peaceful, a simple slipping away between one breath and the next. Preston felt the moment she left, felt something fundamental shift in his world. The funeral was held in the chapel, with half of Grass Valley turning out to pay respects. Wilhelmina had been well loved in the community, known for her kindness and practical wisdom. Preston stood beside the simple pine coffin he and Daniel had built, accepting condolences but barely hearing them. His world had narrowed to a single point of grief. They buried her in a spot she'd chosen herself, on a hillside overlooking the ranch with a view of the mountains she'd loved. Her gravestone was simple. Wilhelmina Abbott Jameson, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She waited in faith and found love. The weeks after the funeral were the hardest of Preston's life. Harder even than those first months after Mary's death, because now he was old and tired, and the weight of loss felt impossibly heavy. He moved through his days mechanically, eating because Daniel insisted, sleeping because exhaustion eventually claimed him. But gradually, as winter gave way to spring, Preston found himself remembering his promise to Wilhelmina, that he would keep living, not just surviving. He started taking his morning coffee on the porch again, watching the sunrise. He rode out to check on the cattle with Daniel, offering advice and stories about the old days. He visited with his grandchildren, letting their energy and joy remind him that life continued. And every Sunday, weather permitting, he made the walk to the chapel and sat on the bench where he'd first found Wilhelmina. Sometimes he prayed, sometimes he just remembered, but always he felt her presence there, a gentle reminder that love transcended physical bounds. Preston lived 5 more years after Wilhelmina's death, dying peacefully at the age of 79. In those final years, he watched his family continue to grow and thrive. He bounced great-great-grandchildren on his knee and saw the ranch expand to over 3,000 acres. He knew that everything he and Wilhelmina had built together would continue long after they were both gone. On his last night, with Daniel sitting vigil beside his bed, Preston drifted in and out of consciousness. In his dreams, he saw Wilhelmina waiting for him in the chapel, young and beautiful as she'd been that first day, her honey-colored eyes full of love. "I'm coming," he whispered. "Wait for me just a little longer." "Always," she replied in his vision. "I'd wait forever for you." Preston died with a smile on his face, and Daniel, through his tears, recognized it as the smile of a man who had lived well and loved deeply, who had known profound loss and found the courage to open his heart again. They buried Preston beside Wilhelmina on the hillside, his gravestone matching hers in simplicity. Preston Jameson, beloved husband, father, and rancher, he built from grief and found joy. The chapel still stands on Jameson land, maintained by generations of descendants who know the story of how their family began. It's a place of pilgrimage for the family, where couples come to marry and parents bring children to teach them about faith and hope and the power of love. The ranch continues to thrive, now a sprawling operation managed by Preston and Wilhelmina's great-great-grandchildren. The land that Preston claimed and built up through decades of hard work has remained in the family, a testament to what can be created when two people find each other against all odds. In Grass Valley, the story of Preston and Wilhelmina has become something of a legend. The lonely rancher and the faithful woman who waited for him in his chapel. Young couples in love visit the hillside where they're buried, leaving flowers and making wishes. The chapel has become a local landmark, a symbol of enduring love and the miracle of second chances. But perhaps the greatest legacy Preston and Wilhelmina left behind isn't the land or the legend, but the family they created together. 6 children who grew into strong, capable adults, who passed on their parents' values of hard work, compassion, and faith. Dozens of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry forward the story, who understand that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the darkest moments. Daniel Jameson, who took over the main ranch, married at 30 to a schoolteacher from town. They raised 4 children in the old ranch house, and Daniel often told them about their grandparents, about how grandmother Wilhelmina had waited 3 years for a vision that led her to their grandfather, about how grandfather Preston had built a chapel from grief and found love waiting there. The children would ask, as children do, whether the vision was real. And Daniel, having heard his parents discuss this very question, would reply that it didn't matter. What mattered was that his mother had believed, had held on to hope when everything seemed hopeless, and that faith had brought her to the place she was meant to be. Love requires faith, Daniel would tell his children. Faith that the person you're meant to be with exists. Faith that you'll find each other. Faith that love is worth the risk of loss. Your grandparents understood that. They both knew profound grief, but they didn't let that grief stop them from loving again. That's courage. That's what I hope you'll all remember, and remember they did. The story passed down through generations, growing and changing slightly with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. That sometimes a lonely heart and a hopeful heart find each other in the most unexpected ways, and from that meeting, something beautiful and lasting can grow. The Jameson family prospered through the decades, weathering economic downturns and personal tragedies, always held together by the foundation Preston and Wilhelmina had established. The values they'd instilled, hard work, compassion, faith, resilience, became the family's bedrock. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and California transformed from wild frontier to modern state, The Jameson Ranch adapted, but never lost sight of its origins. The chapel remained a constant, carefully preserved and regularly visited, a physical reminder of where it all began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun sets over the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange, if you stand very still in that small chapel, you can almost feel them there. Preston and Wilhelmina, together again in the place where their story began, their love as enduring as the land they built upon, as lasting as the faith that brought them together. Their story ends not with death but with legacy. A family that spans generations, a ranch that continues to thrive, and a chapel that stands as testament to the power of faith, the resilience of the human heart, and the miraculous possibility that sometimes, when we wait with hope and courage, we find exactly what we're meant to find, exactly when we're meant to find it.